Bonjour, hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. Je m'appelle Jennifer Elric et je suis la directrice par intérim de l'Institut d'études canadiennes de McGill pour 2024-2025 pendant que Daniel Belland est en congé sabbatique. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at MISC to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, or MISC, is the Centre for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events, such as this event tonight, on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. You can learn more about our work at www.mcgill.ca/MISC. Today we are pleased to welcome you to the Fall 2024 Mallory Lecture. I would like to take a minute to thank the Mallory family. Mr. Charles Mallory and his wife Dorothy have kindly joined us this evening, whose support enriches the study of Canada at McGill and makes possible these annual lectures. J.R. Mallory, after whom the lecture series is named, was a professor of political science. He was born in 1916 in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and was educated at New Brunswick University, Dalhousie University, and the University of Edinburgh. His career took him to Saskatchewan, Toronto, Brandon, and McGill, where he served for 45 years and was chair of the Economics and Political Science departments for 10 years. After retiring in 1982, he was appointed Professor Emeritus and continued to teach for another 10 years. Professor Mallory passed away in 2003. The endowment for the J.R. Mallory Lecture in Canadian Studies was established in January 1995. The lecture has featured such renowned speakers as Bob Ray, Andrew Coyne, Alain Dubec, Tom Kent, John Gomery, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Cohen, Noah Rickler, Elizabeth May, and Thomas Mulcair. Our Mallory Lecture this year is Professor Irene Bloemraad, who holds the President's Excellence Chair in Global Migration at the University of British Columbia and is Professor of Political Science and Sociology at that university. Prior to her appointment at UBC in July 2024, Irene Bloemraad spent 2 decades at the University of California, Berkeley, where she held the class of 1951 chair in sociology, the Thomas Barnes Chair in Canadian Studies, and where she founded the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative. Professor Bloemraad studies how migrants become incorporated into the political communities where they live, and the consequences of migration for politics and national membership. Her research has been published in over 100 articles spanning sociology, political science, history, and ethnic and racial studies and migration studies. She has authored or co-authored 5 books on citizenship, immigrant protest, and civic organizations. An award-winning researcher and teacher, Professor Bloemraad regularly shares her work with policymakers, immigration stakeholders, and the general public. Today, Professor Bloemraad will discuss the effects of current policy and politics on undocumented migration in Canada and give an overview of survey findings on Canadians' willingness to help precarious migrants facing hardship. She will conclude by considering what all of this means for those who support migrants, for Canadian policy, and for Canadian-US relations. I will now turn it over to Professor Bloemraad. Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Thank you to Jennifer and her team at MISC for inviting me and for hosting me. I know that these things are never easy to organize, so I really appreciate both the invitation and the warm welcome I've received. When I was invited to give the Mallory Lecture, I asked to learn something about the person about who this lecture is named. And it seems that there's at least a little bit parallels between my life and Professor Mallory's life. I did most of my elementary school and my high school in Saskatchewan, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and then I came to McGill as an undergraduate. So I made that same transition from Saskatchewan to Montreal. I did political science at McGill, so my first degree is a bachelor's degree in poli-sci, and then I stayed for an extra year to do a one-year master's in sociology. So it is an absolute delight to be back at McGill. I love Montreal. I was so pleased when I got this invitation, so thank you very much, Jennifer. All right, immigration's in the news recently. That's putting it mildly, right? Immigration, I think, is always a topic of interest. I come to it both from personal experience, but also because how interdisciplinary migration truly is. It requires insights from sociology, political science, economics, philosophy in terms of the ethics of what we do and why we do it. And today I want to maybe shift the conversation a little bit in the Canadian space to move from important debates around economic migration, international students, what the numbers should be. That's all going to come up, hopefully, in the talk. But I want to sort of think about the implications for our policies for what that might mean for people who fall out of status, and then what Canadians feel about those who fall out of status. And when I was given the invitation, I was asked to sort of put this in the context of US and Canadian relations and also what's happened in the United States since I was at Berkeley for over 20 years. So let's start there. Given that we're about a week away from a major election down south, many of you have probably been following the discourse around immigration in the United States. Very much a focus on mass deportation and undocumented migration, and uncertainty about what's going to happen following the election. Now, this affects a lot of people. Just to sort of, I'm a professor, I do pop quizzes. Let's see how much you guys are paying attention to the news. Any estimates that people are willing to give about how many undocumented residents live in the United States? I got a 10 million? I got a 20? High, under 10 million? Hands? Under 10? Okay. Anyone want to go over 20? All right. Where do we want to go between 10 and 20? 18, 11. Okay, all right. Some of you did well. 11 to 12. So that's a lot of people, right? That's basically the entire population of BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan combined. So this is an issue that really affects a lot of people in the United States. One of the things to know is that undocumented immigrants do make up a very large share of the immigrant population in the United States. So when I use the term immigrant, I'm using it in its sociological sense, which means someone who's a foreign-born individual who is living in the United States. So irrespective of their status, if we look at the entire population of foreign-born people in the US, what are their statuses? About a quarter are undocumented, about half have become naturalized citizens. So these are the only ones who can actually vote next week, right? So only half the immigrants have a voice. And then approximately a quarter are legal permanent residents, with a small sliver who have some kind of temporary status. Now, Americans' views on undocumented immigrants is actually pretty complicated. So despite what you might see from some of the rallies for candidate Trump, people can hold almost contradictory positions in their heads at the same time. And I'm going to tell you that Americans are not unique in this. So according to recent polls, more than half of those surveyed agree that there should be mass deportation. So this is a pretty significant number. So that's basically saying, maybe we'll take 11, 12 million people, take them out of their homes, their workplaces, their schools, and send them elsewhere. But at the same time, even bigger proportions of people, almost 2/3, say that they actually support pathways to legalization with some kind of conditions. So they're holding both this, we want to deport, but also we want pathways to legalization. And of course, the crux of the question is who and what kind of people get one way, and who and what kind of people do they believe should go the other way. But I want you to know that despite what you might be seeing in the news, US public opinion on this is complicated, and really there's a lot to be grappling with. Let's go to Canada now. So this has not been an issue, really, for Canada for any significant amount of time. But if you had to guess, how many people in Canada are currently out of status? 200,000? 600,000? 500,000.
Almost 10% of the American number, right?
10% of the American, yeah, 10% of the population. So that would be 1.1 million. Yeah. All right, so we actually don't know. And I say that wearing my academic hat, we actually cannot estimate this number with the same accuracy that scholars in the United States can. Scholars in the United States have been grappling with this for a long time, and so there's some pretty good ways of doing these estimates. Plus, as was sort of hinted at, the US population's 10 times the Canadian population, so even if you get the estimate slightly off, you can still get in the ballpark. When you bring that down to 1/10, you have big margins of errors. So the most common numbers are somewhere between 80,000 to 500,000. That's a huge range, right? At one point, Cabinet was apparently briefed that it could be up to 1 million, but again, we don't know. So the short answer is we don't know. So, should this be an issue? Should we as Canadians be concerned about this? And I'm going to, if you walk out of this talk with at least one thing in your mind, I want you to think that we need to get ahead of this because it is going to be an issue. It might already be an issue, but if it's not a huge issue now, it is going to be an issue in the future. So pay attention. And we should start thinking about this and grappling with it. So in order to make that case, let me take a step back. I'm still putting my professor hat on, and give you a 101 on immigration policy, not just in Canada, but anywhere in the world. There tends to be 3 doors that people can come in when they are taking a pathway to legal immigration, so getting permanent residency. One is the one that Canada does above all others, which is economic selection. So you are picked because you fulfill some kind of labor market needs, you have certain human capital. The country has decided that they want you for economic reasons. A second reason is for family reunification. This is the main way that the United States hands out green cards or permanent residency. So it's who you know, and it better be someone who knows you in your family, because that person can then sponsor you. And then the third way, which in both Canada and the United States is basically the least numerous, tends to be, is forced migration. So these are people who are resettled as refugees, people who make asylum claims, and their asylum claims are accepted. And so that is actually our smallest doorway, usually. And this just gives you a sense of where those numbers have been in the Canadian context. So you can see that, since 2012, so over the last 10, 15 years, the economic category has been by far the highest number of immigrants who are coming in. I will add the asterisk that the economic category includes the dependents of the primary applicant. So in a way, there's a lot of family hidden in that economic category. So like if someone gets selected as an economic migrant and they have a spouse and a child, those people also fall under there. So it's a little bit mixed, but it's largely economic. And then you see the family category, the refugee and protected person, and the humanitarian. There was the dip during COVID, and then a rebound, especially on the economic category since then. So given that that's the open door, or the somewhat open door, what are the pathways to being out of status? So the one we see, especially if we're looking at the US news, is entry without inspection, right? So these are people, for example, in the United States, who are coming from South America, who are flying into Central America, who are walking, taking the train, the bus, up to the US-Mexico border and crossing into the US-Mexico border. These are people taking boats from Cuba, from Haiti, coming across to Florida and landing in Florida. So people coming in without inspection. Canada is sort of geographically fortunate. It's already hard to walk from El Salvador to the US border. It's even harder to get all the way to the Canadian border, right? Try going from Sudan or Myanmar to Canada. It's pretty difficult. So Canada has the benefit of geography in that the same pressure that you see in Europe as boats go across the Mediterranean or as people in the, come to the US-Mexico border, Canadians are insulated from that. So often when we talk about how Canadians have historically been very pro-immigration or at least very supportive, it's in part because the kind of pressures that you see in Germany and Italy, in the United States, have not really hit Canada in any big numbers. So Canadians can be proud of their tolerance, but their tolerance might be a lot because of geographic fortune in part. So we don't get that many people who are entering without inspection. It happens, but it's more rare. What really happens for our out-of-status people is that they stay beyond a visa expiry. So they come on a legitimate visa, a tourist visa, a temporary visa to work or study, and they overstay the conditions of their visa. And so this was our permanent migration stream, new permanent residents of Canada. I'm going to show you how that compares to the temporary migration stream that Canada has seen explode in the last decade. So we're going to first squish down our permanent residents, and then we're going to overlay it with our temporary residents. So what you should take from this graph is that if you go back to 2014, those temporary residents were roughly at numbers like the permanent immigration system coming in. And then over the last 10 years, we've seen this explosion in temporary permits, either for work or for study, whereas the sort of permanent resident pathways have stayed pretty stable. There's been some increases, but nowhere near the increases for the temporary. Now, in terms of whether this is a good policy or a bad policy, there's an ethics question. So you can raise questions about, should we have a two-step immigration system where we give people these temporary visas, we expect them to go home, but we sort of give them a side door maybe into the permanent system? That I think it's a political question, it's an ethical question. But in terms of social science, I can tell you that when you have a very substantial temporary system, some of those people are not going to go, they're going to stay. And we've seen this in Europe after World War II with the guest worker programs, where Germany, the Netherlands, other countries thought they could welcome temporary workers from Turkey, from Morocco, and then they would go once economic conditions changed. And of course, when economic conditions changed, if the homeland is still not looking so great, you're not going to be that interested in going back. In the United States during World War II, and then for about 20 years after, there was the Bracero program, which allowed Mexicans to come and work in agriculture on the railways. Same idea, okay, when economic conditions change, or when we think that the job should only go to Americans, we're going to get rid of that. But the employers were pretty happy with the temporary workers. The temporary workers liked having those jobs. And so it's very hard to end a temporary worker program. And that's not even to say about people falling in love, making relationships. If they've been temporary students or temporary workers for a while, they're going to build those kind of community relationships. And so, thinking of people as disposable labor is a little bit hard when they're human beings. So irrespective of whether you think this is a good policy or a bad policy, if you have an exploding temporary worker program or temporary students, you are probably going to get undocumented migration at some point in the future, because the temporary people might stay and then fall out of status. So again, one thing to take away from this is we might be dealing with maybe not quite the same issues as the United States or Italy or Germany, but it will certainly be more than we have in the past. All right, so this is where we go to, what do Canadians think about this? So all of that vaunted or sort of celebrated Canadian tolerance, When it comes to those in temporary status or those who are out of status, it's not clear. I think it's complicated, just like with the Americans. A very recent poll suggested that over half of Canadians are opposed to a citizenship pathway for all temporary workers. So it's not the case that people are like, yes, we want to keep all of these people. If they don't, what happens is an interesting question to ask. And this sort of led me to research that I now want to share with you. So I'm going from sort of big picture down to a particular project, the results of which were recently published in the Canadian Journal of Political Science. And I'm going to delve into this question about how do Canadians feel about the rights of out-of-status residents. So here, I and my collaborators, which includes Alison Harel at Université du Québec à Montréal, we were interested in knowing whether Canadians would have different views on sort of the rights and benefits that could be given to someone if they were out of status compared to whether they were Canadian, and how that might interact with race. And so the intersection of race and legal status. So what we did was something called a survey experiment using vignettes. And I'm going to walk you through what that means. It's actually kind of cool. A lot of people are doing these, but when we started, it was a little bit newer, at least for me in sociology. So Alison is a co-PI on the Canadian Democracy Checkup Survey. This is a huge survey done regularly of people living in Canada, asking them about a host of different political questions. We had a number of questions inserted into that survey to sort of see what people think about out-of-status individuals. So this is a general population survey of adults, 18 years and older. It includes citizens and permanent residents. It was conducted across Canada. It was done in both English and French. So this is the survey. It was done online, largely, and that allowed us to do sort of our random experiment here. So, just like a medical experiment where you randomly assign some people to get the new drug and other people to get a placebo, and then you check to see whether the new drug is working, same kind of idea with a survey experiment. You're manipulating parts of a question or sometimes an answer, but usually it's the question. You're manipulating things in the question to see how the outcome might be different because you're changing something in terms of the wording or how people are being portrayed. What we did is we manipulated whether the person was described as a Canadian citizen or someone who overstayed a visa. So people randomly either got the citizen or the overstayed visa. And then the other thing we varied was the implicit race ethnicity of the person. Well, explicitly their sort of ethnic or national origin, implicitly their race. So we described someone who was either French or Irish, and we gave sort of typically French or Irish names. We assumed that people would think that these people were white, though obviously France in particular, but even Ireland, there are people of color. And then we had a Haitian and a Jamaican person described. Again, we were assuming people would expect these people to be black, though again, especially in the Jamaican case, there might be some who are not. But we picked names that we thought would signal white, black to the respondents. And so we were randomly assigning both citizen, non-citizen, and these names to people. And then what we did is we described a scenario that the person was facing. This was the vignette part of it. And here we wanted to get at something that might conceivably be considered a human rights abuse. So in other research I do, I look to see whether framing something as a human rights issue or an issue of Canadian values actually changes public opinion, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. But we wanted to start with vignettes, which sort of maybe triggered things that were so egregious and so problematic that it would elicit concern in terms of rights or public benefits. So the first thing we picked is what we would call a negative right or a civil right. So this is freedom from the state. And so what we did is we looked at a police stop or multiple police stops. And so the vignette, the story that we told people was someone's name, someone's status, lives in a high crime area in her community. She has never done anything wrong, but the police have repeatedly stopped her when she's been out in the evenings. The police officers regularly ask her to explain what she's doing out. So this was supposed to, sort of elicit in people's brains that, the police are violating this person's civil rights potentially. And then we wanted something that political scientists and philosophers call sort of positive or social rights, so not just freedom from the state, but the state's actually doing something for you, is sort of using taxpayer funds to be generous. And in this case, we replicated a question or a scenario that I'd already used in California, so I've done versions of this research in California. So we have a name, a status. This person has a very low income. She must often skip meals and eat smaller portions than is healthy. Sometimes a whole day or longer goes by without her eating anything. So this is getting at food insecurity. So this is sort of a typical way that social scientists and people in government ask about food insecurity, who's using food banks, who might be needing extra benefits. In the US, this would be for food stamps, for example, for those who know the US system. So these were our vignettes. So in sort of giving you a sense of what this would be, there'd be a person responding to our survey. They would be told, please read the situation below and answering the following question. They would get this situation, so the one like for food insecurity, and it would say explicitly, Nadège Bien-Aimée came to Canada from Haiti on a temporary visa that has expired, leaving her without valid immigration papers, right? So we're saying here she is out of status, Nadège has a low income, etc. And then we asked, should Nadège receive extra benefits from the government to ensure she has enough to eat? So that would be the question. And people answer either they strongly agree, yes, the government should step in and help her, they somewhat agree, they're neutral, they disagree, or they really disagree. No, she should not get help. And then for the civil rights scenario, we would have, for example, Amancia James is a Canadian citizen, originally from Jamaica, and then we'd have the civil rights scenario. In this case, rather than asking a single question, we had an index of questions. So we had 4 different questions asking about whether what the police were doing was fair, unfair, were they just doing their jobs, was this a problem, should a complaint be filed? So we had 4 different questions, 2 of them which were like the police are just doing their job, this is totally fine, 2 of them which is this is problematic and there should be a complaint. And so we were trying to get a more robust sense of what people thought about this. So that was the scenario. So you can imagine you're sitting in front of your computer, you're answering these questions. You don't know this is an experiment. You don't know that we're randomly assigning some people to these different treatments. And so the advantage of that is that what we can do is we can compare the people who got the citizen scenario or the white out of status scenario together because they don't know what's happening in these other ones. And what we hope is that we're not getting quite as much of a problem called social desirability bias. So if you ask people outright, are you a racist? They're probably going to say, no, probably. And if you ask them pretty explicit questions, they're going to figure out what's probably going on. And so one of the hopes with this kind of research is it's not masking it entirely. I mean, people are realizing that you're asking about these specific individuals, but because they don't see that there's these different scenarios, we can aggregate across them and get a sense of what's the same and what's different. So let me give you some results. This is the question about are police stops a problem? So we go from strongly agree to a neutral position to strongly disagree. We have on this graph on your left is the people who are presumably white, on the right those who are presumably black, and then I have citizen and undocumented. So first of all, when it comes to a white citizen, there is modest support for the fact that this is a problem. So, that's interesting. Canadians apparently maybe have some tolerance for police stops. We put in regularly so that we were trying to get at this is systematic, this is just not a one-off. But, there's a slight tendency to saying this is a problem. When it comes to a black citizen, more people say it's a problem. And more people are more likely to say it's strongly a problem. And there's actually a statistically significant difference between those two, such that people are more likely to see a problem when a black citizen is being stopped than a white citizen. Notice the year. This is 2020. We were in the field right around the time of George Floyd's murder. So this is when really these issues exploded, I think, including for the Canadian public. We redid this experiment 2 years later, and we found an even stronger effect where people said, this is a problem for a black citizen. So there has been attention to the racialized nature, I think, of policing, such that the black citizen is seen as facing more of a problem than a white citizen. Okay, let's go to our undocumented cases. If it's an undocumented white person, people are much less likely to see it as a problem, and that is statistically significant. So remember, they don't know that we're comparing these, but like if you say, oh, there's this undocumented person from France or Ireland getting stopped by the police, people are like, oh, okay, more neutral. And if it's also a black undocumented person, they're less likely to see it as a problem, and that's statistically significant from the citizen. So overall, if you're undocumented, the Canadian respondents we had were less likely to see what might be considered a civil rights violation as a violation. So the status was really important. And then I would point out that especially for the black undocumented scenario, to the extent that we think police stops might be racialized, and so people are targeted because of how they look, it seems like Canadians are not paying attention just to the race aspect of it, which might be the primary thing, because if someone looks at you, they probably don't know your citizenship. But it's that intersection where it's race and citizenship I'm concerned. If it's race and undocumented, maybe I'm a little bit less concerned. Let me move on to the hunger. So remember, this was a question about someone who was facing some pretty severe hunger, was skipping meals. Should the government give some kind of support for this person? When it's a white citizen, there's actually quite a lot of agreement that there should be some support. So it's definitely on the positive side, and more around, some would agree. Like, we think that that should be a concern. For the black citizen, slightly less, and it was statistically significant in 2020, not in 2022. But in 2020, when presented with a black citizen, Canadians were slightly less likely to say, yes, the government should step in and help somebody. So here we see sort of a race effect in that people were more generous to white citizens than to black citizens. Here's the undocumented case. So this person is still facing hunger, still skipping meals. Canadians are almost neutral in terms of thinking the government should come in and help. Same thing with someone who's black and undocumented. So the story here is, again, if you're out of status, people are not particularly excited about having the government step in and help you, even if you're not having enough to eat. I will say that these results are very similar to what I found in California. And so in that case, I'm not sure that Canadian public opinion is really that different than California. Now, California is, of course, one of the most sort of liberal democratic places in the United States. But in California, too, generally people are quite reluctant to give social benefits to those who are undocumented. All right, now I'm going to go back big picture. So I've given you just like a taste of some of the public opinion sentiment. What now? Where are we going forward? In terms of permanent migration in Canada, this is a graph I took from Jennifer Elrick. This is the level of permanent resident new applications or new acceptances over time, all the way back from 1950, so a really nice time span. And you can see that the numbers have been going up over the last few years, and quite steeply in the last few years with the increase in the government's ceilings on the numbers. And then, as I'm sure many of you have read in the last week, the government has reduced those numbers, so we're going down to 395,000, maybe all the way down to 365,000. Note that even if it goes down to 365,000, we're still pretty close to those really high numbers that we had previously. So even though in the media, the political discussion has been like, this is a big cut to migration, it is based on the targets that they set for themselves, but historically, it's not that big of a cut. In fact, it's still at the very high end of where we were on permanent migration. Now let's think about those temporary visa holders. So remember, this has been going up. Again, if you've been watching the news, these are going down supposedly too. And so the pressures to reduce some of these numbers, especially say the study permits. But again, these numbers are still relatively high, and they remain higher than the permanent residents. Right? So remember, the caps on the permanent residents are going under 400,000. These are still all over 400,000. So we're still letting in more new temporary permits than we have permanent positions. So again, looking into the future, there's going to be some mismatch if some proportion of those temporary students or temporary workers want to become permanent immigrants. There's no match of numbers there. All right. Who knows what's going to happen next week? I don't. I'm pessimistic. But in his recent, this is something that Trump has been saying for a long time, but at his recent rally at Madison Square Gardens, he said, on day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. It is uncertain what will happen. There will be fights in the courts. But I think he believes in this, and he will certainly want to show people that he's doing what he said he will do. So I have a feeling that if Trump does get into office, there will be raids, and they will be very spectacular, especially early in his presidency, in order to show that he did what he promised he was going to do. And so what does that mean for Canada? It probably means that we're going to be getting many more people arriving at Roxham Road and on our borders, and we're going to be getting many asylum claims, and we are then going to have to process those asylum claims. And then for those who do not get given asylum, what happens? Because those people, if they fail their asylum claim but they don't want to leave Canada, will fall out of status. And so we will be at exactly this question of how do we deal with a burgeoning out of status population. I do not have answers. I would prefer to have a conversation about this. But as I said, maybe I'm going to have two things that you take from this talk now. Number one is the increase and sort of the ballooning of temporary statuses without some secure pathway or some way of bringing people into status is going to create an out of status issue here in Canada, and it's going to get bigger. And if it does, it's not clear to me that Canadians are any more generous than Americans. And just as Americans have very complex views on this, so do Canadians. And so if we can start that conversation now and get ahead of the issue, I think we'd be in a much better place to have sort of reasonable discussion about it rather than the kind of emotional race baiting and sort of vilifying of immigrants that we're seeing south of the border. Thank you very much.